Curtis Hamilton was 43 years old and worked the overnight security shift at Rocky Mountain Secure Storage in Colorado Springs. Most people saw a tired man driving an old silver Ford F-150 with faded paint and coffee stains on the console. The neighbors thought Danielle had outgrown him years ago. Every morning at 6:15, Curtis ate the same bacon and eggs special. At Maple Diner alone, quite forgettable. What nobody knew was that Curtis once led ranger teams through places the government never discussed publicly. Outside McKenna's steakhouse, Brandon Pierce stepped into the cold night air, pulled off his watch, and pointed at Curtis in front of a crowd, while a black Chevy Tahoe idled silently across the street. If you're watching tonight, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn revenge stories with real consequences, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. The Hamilton house sat on a quiet street in northern Colorado Springs, 15 minutes from downtown, if traffic on Interstate 25 stayed light. Small front lawn, white siding, a cracked basketball hoop near the garage that nobody had touched in years. From the outside, it still looked like a normal marriage. Inside, the silence had changed shape. Curtis noticed it first in the kitchen. Danielle stopped asking whether he wanted coffee before his shift. Then she stopped eating dinner at home 3 nights a week. After that, she stopped explaining where she was going altogether. The house developed routines that no longer matched each other. Curtis worked nights at Rocky Mountain Secure Storage off Garden of the Gods Road. Danielle sold luxury homes with Aspen Ridge Realty near downtown. He slept during the mornings. She left before noon, wearing expensive perfume and carrying leather folders she never used to own. At 5:40 every evening, Curtis still walked their German Shepherd Duke around the neighborhood. He still paid the mortgage through First National Bank, still changed the furnace filters every month, still fixed things before they broke completely. Danielle stopped noticing any of it. One Thursday in October, Curtis came home at 6:12 a.m. after a 12-hour shift. Snow clouds hung low over the mountains west of the city. His shoulders ached from walking concrete hallways all night. Danielle's white Mercedes GLE was already in the driveway. That surprised him. She normally stayed in Denver on Thursdays now. Client meetings. She called them. Curtis stepped inside quietly. The house smelled faintly of vanilla candles and wine. He found Danielle asleep on the couch upstairs instead of their bedroom. Her heels were kicked near the coffee table. One champagne-colored dress sleeve hung halfway off her shoulder. A phone vibrated softly beside her hand. Curtis wasn't the kind of man who searched through phones. Never had been. But the screen lit up again. Brandon Pierce. A text preview appeared beneath the name. Last night was worth every risk. Curtis stared at the screen for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. No yelling, no shaking her awake, no dramatic confrontation like the movies. He walked into the kitchen instead, turned on the coffee maker, fed Duke. Outside, snow began falling in slow, quiet flakes over the backyard fence. Curtis stood at the sink, holding a black ceramic mug, while the text replayed in his head with mechanical precision. Worth every risk. Not love you, not miss you. That bothered him more. Military training had rewired Curtis years ago. Most people looked at situations emotionally first. Curtis looked for patterns. Patterns kept men alive. Danielle started hiding her phone 6 months ago. Her spending changed 4 months ago. Denver trips increased 3 months ago. Gym membership charges appeared 2 months ago. The text this morning simply confirmed what the timeline already suggested. At 7:03 a.m., Danielle walked into the kitchen wearing one of his old gray army hoodies. She opened the refrigerator without looking at him. "You're home early," she said. "Normal time." Curtis watched her pour sparkling water into a glass. Her nails were professionally done now. Dark red. Expensive. "You were in Denver?" he asked calmly. She didn't flinch. "Business dinner." Curtis nodded once. "Nothing else?" That almost irritated her more than accusations would have. Danielle leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "You know, most husbands would ask more questions." Curtis took another sip of coffee. "If you wanted me to know something, you'd tell me." Danielle gave a small, humorless laugh. "That's the problem with you, Curtis. You just sit there, always quiet, always passive." He said nothing. She stared at him harder, almost waiting for resistance. "I'm serious," she continued. "You act like life just happens to you." Curtis looked toward the snow outside. A year ago, comments like that might have started an argument. Now, they landed like pebbles against concrete. Danielle moved upstairs to shower. Her phone remained on the kitchen island for exactly 22 seconds before she rushed back down to grab it. Curtis noticed that too. Later that afternoon, after sleeping 4 hours, Curtis stopped at a Sinclair gas station on Nevada Avenue before work. He bought black coffee and a turkey sandwich. The cashier, an older man named Louis, nodded at him. "You look tired today. Long week." Louis glanced outside toward Curtis's old Ford. "You still keeping that truck alive?" Curtis almost smiled. Trying. People saw him and made decisions quickly. Old truck. Night security job. Quiet personality. Finished man. The truth stayed buried because Curtis preferred it there. Nobody at Rocky Mountain Secure Storage knew he once led 12-man Ranger operations outside Kandahar. Nobody knew he had received a Bronze Star with valor. Nobody knew Colonel Victor Grayson personally recommended him for command leadership at 32 years old. Curtis never corrected assumptions. That habit came from overseas, too. The dangerous men were usually the calm ones. At work, he completed his rounds exactly every 45 minutes. Checked gates, logged delivery times, reviewed camera feeds. At 1:17 a.m., while monitoring Building C cameras, his phone buzzed again. Danielle. For a second, Curtis considered ignoring it. Then he answered. "What's wrong, Silence?" Background music, glasses clinking. Then Danielle's voice, slightly drunk. "You know what Brandon said tonight?" Curtis leaned back slowly in his chair. "No. He said you moved through life like somebody already buried you." Curtis's eyes stayed on the security monitors. A forklift operator smoked behind Unit 214 on Camera 6. Snow drifted sideways across the loading lot. Danielle laughed softly into the phone. And honestly, he's not wrong. Curtis listened without interrupting. You could have done more with your life, she continued. You just settled. That word stayed with him after the call ended. Settled. At 2:04 a.m., Curtis opened the employee incident database and typed Brandon Pierce into a private search field connected to visitor logs. 3 entries appeared immediately. Brandon Pierce had visited Rocky Mountain Secure Storage 6 times in the last 2 months, all after 11 p.m., all connected to Unit 214. Curtis stared at the screen. Then he opened the tenant information attached to the unit. The rental account belonged to Aspen Ridge Realty, Danielle's company. Curtis sat perfectly still in the dim security office while camera screens flickered blue across his face. Outside, snow covered the parking lot in silence. Inside Building C, Camera 6 showed someone standing near Unit 214. Tall, broad shoulders, black hoodie. The man slowly looked directly up at the security camera. It was Brandon Pierce, and he was smiling. By November, Danielle stopped pretending Brandon Pierce was a secret. The first public appearance happened on a Sunday afternoon during the Willow Creek neighborhood barbecue. Every fall, the Homeowners Association rented 2 propane grills and blocked off the cul-de-sac for families. Children rode vehicles between parked SUVs. Football played quietly from somebody's garage television. Men stood around coolers pretending not to compare salaries. Curtis arrived late after sleeping through most of the afternoon. He wore a dark flannel jacket and old jeans faded at the knees. Duke stayed home because the dog hated crowds. Curtis carried a bowl of store-bought potato salad Danielle told him to bring. Nobody noticed him at first. Then Brandon Pierce pulled into the cul-de-sac like he wanted everyone to hear the engine. Black Dodge Hellcat, custom exhaust, music loud enough to shake nearby windows. Several heads turned immediately. Brandon stepped out wearing a fitted charcoal sweater that stretched across his chest and arms. Expensive watch. Bright white sneakers untouched by dirt or snow. His beard looked professionally trimmed down to exact lines. Confident men usually moved one of 2 ways: calm or performative. Brandon performed. Danielle walked around the passenger side, smiling before he even reached her door. Curtis noticed small details automatically. The way Brandon placed his hand on her lower back immediately. The way Danielle laughed harder around him than she had around Curtis in years. The way Brandon scanned the street first, measuring his audience. Predators and insecure men both did that. Curtis Danielle called loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. You made it. Curtis walked over slowly. Brandon extended his hand before Danielle could speak. So this is the famous husband. His grip came hard immediately. Too hard. A dominance test. Curtis let him squeeze. Brandon's smile tightened slightly when Curtis showed no reaction. I've heard a lot about you, Brandon said. Hopefully something good. Danielle laughed at that. Not warmly, more like someone rewarding a joke. Brandon released Curtis's hand and looked him up and down casually. Danielle says you work nights, right? Security supervisor. At a storage place. Curtis nodded once. Brandon whistled softly. Damn, exciting life. A few men nearby smirked into their beer bottles. Curtis reached for a paper plate from the folding table. The cold air smelled like charcoal smoke and pine trees drifting from the mountains west of town. Brandon followed him anyway. You ever think about doing something bigger? Brandon asked. I mean, no offense, man, but security jobs are basically adult hall monitor positions. Danielle laughed again. This time, Curtis heard nervousness buried underneath it, like she wanted Brandon entertained. Curtis spooned potato salad onto his plate carefully. Bills get paid. That's enough for you. Curtis looked at him. For now. Brandon shook his head with theatrical disbelief. I could never live like that. Curtis said nothing. Silence bothered Brandon more than arguments would have. Men like Brandon understood conflict. They understood shouting threats, ego. Quiet men forced them to keep talking until they exposed themselves. Later, Curtis stood near the edge of the street drinking black coffee from a foam cup, while snow clouds rolled over Pikes Peak in the distance. A man approached beside him. Tom Alvarez, 58 years old, former Marine Staff Sergeant, lived 3 houses down. Tom watched Brandon across the street, showing teenagers how much he could bench press by using a picnic table. That guy talks too much, Tom muttered. Curtis gave a faint nod. Tom glanced sideways at him. You military? Curtis looked ahead. Long time ago. Knew it. Curtis almost asked how. Tom answered anyway. Guys like him, Tom said quietly, nodding toward Brandon. They always think loud means dangerous. Across the street, Brandon wrapped one arm around Danielle's waist while telling a story to a group gathered around him. Every few seconds, he glanced toward Curtis to see whether he was watching. Curtis noticed another thing, too. Danielle looked different around Brandon. Not happier, sharper, like she was constantly performing too. At sunset, neighborhood lights flickered on one by one along the street. The temperature dropped fast. Curtis helped fold tables without being asked, hauled trash bags into the HOA dumpster, stacked chairs, while Brandon continued drinking bourbon near the fire pit surrounded by listeners. As Curtis carried the final folding table toward the trailer, Brandon intercepted him near the sidewalk. You know, Brandon said casually, most guys would have gotten pissed off by now. Curtis kept walking. About what? Brandon matched his pace. Me. Curtis set the table into the trailer rack carefully before answering. You haven't done anything to me. That made Brandon's smile wider. Oh, come on. Let's not pretend. Curtis closed the trailer latch. Cold wind swept through the cul-de-sac. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice. Brandon stepped closer. I know Danielle's unhappy man. Curtis looked directly at him now. Brandon's eyes carried something familiar. Not confidence, hunger, the need to win visibly. Curtis had seen that look overseas before firefights. Young soldiers trying too hard to prove fear didn't exist. Dangerous men didn't usually advertise themselves. Brandon lowered his voice. She told me you stopped acting like a husband years ago. Curtis remained still. She said you just drift around half asleep. Nothing. Brandon laughed softly. Honestly, I almost felt bad for you. Curtis turned to leave. Brandon spoke again. You know what your problem is? Curtis stopped, but didn't face him. You never fight back. For the first time all evening, Curtis felt something move beneath the surface. Not anger, recognition. Brandon wasn't trying to insult him anymore. He was testing limits. Curtis finally looked over his shoulder. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement behind them. Music from the remaining fire pit crackled faintly through the cold air. You should be careful. Assuming that Curtis said calmly. The words landed differently than Brandon expected. No threat. No raised voice. Just certainty. Brandon's smile faded for half a second. Then Danielle appeared beside them, carrying her purse. Everything okay? Perfect, Brandon answered quickly. Curtis noticed. She looked between them with sudden tension. Like she realized something Brandon didn't. Curtis walked back toward his truck alone. His silver Ford sat beneath a street lamp near the end of the cul-de-sac. Snow dusted the windshield lightly. Rust showed near the rear bumper. Ordinary truck. Ordinary man. Curtis opened the driver's side door and stopped. A folded piece of paper sat tucked beneath his windshield wiper. He removed it slowly. No envelope. Just one handwritten sentence in black marker. She deserves better than this life. Curtis stared at the message while neighborhood laughter echoed faintly behind him. Then he looked up. Across the street, Brandon stood beside Danielle, with one arm around her shoulders, watching him, smiling. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in a thick white envelope stamped with the logo of Hanson and Cole Family Law. Curtis found them wedged between grocery store coupons and an electricity bill when he checked the mailbox at 10:14 a.m. Snow from the night before still covered the edges of the driveway. Duke stood beside him, breathing clouds into the cold air while Curtis flipped through the pages without expression. Petition for legal separation. Request for temporary, exclusive use of marital residence. Concerns regarding emotional intimidation. Curtis read every line once beside the mailbox. Then he walked back into the house and placed the papers neatly on the kitchen counter. No slammed doors, no curse words, no phone thrown against the wall. Danielle came downstairs 20 minutes later, wearing cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her car keys. She stopped when she saw the envelope. You got served already. Curtis looked up from his coffee. Looks like it. Danielle waited for anger. What? That's it, she asked. Curtis folded one page carefully. What response are you expecting? Danielle crossed her arms. Most people would at least ask why. Curtis studied her face for a moment. The woman standing in front of him still looked familiar in pieces. Same green eyes, same small scar near her chin from a skiing accident in Breckenridge years earlier. But something colder sat behind it now. You already made your decision, Curtis said quietly. So asking why doesn't change anything. Danielle laughed under her breath. That's exactly the problem with you. She grabbed her purse from the counter. You move through life like nothing matters. The front door shut behind her, hard enough to rattle the dining room windows. Curtis waited until her Mercedes backed out of the driveway before looking down at the paperwork again. One sentence caught his attention immediately. Mrs. Hamilton reports patterns of emotionally suppressive behavior, causing fear and instability within the marital home. Curtis read it twice. Instability. He leaned back slowly in the kitchen chair. Military intelligence reports overseas often relied on emotional wording instead of direct facts. Curtis learned years ago that language mattered more than volume. Accusations didn't need to be true immediately. They only needed to sound possible. At 1 p.m., Curtis parked outside Hanson & Cole's downtown office building near Tejon Street. The law firm occupied the 7th floor of a modern glass building overlooking Colorado Springs traffic below. Inside, everything smelled like polished wood and expensive coffee. Young associates in fitted suits moved quickly through hallways carrying tablets and folders. Curtis wore dark jeans boots and his old brown jacket. Several people glanced at him the same way people always did. Working-class husband. Probably confused. Probably about to lose everything. A receptionist with perfect white teeth handed him a clipboard. Please, wait for Ms. Sloan. Curtis sat quietly near the windows. Outside, snowmelt dripped down parking meters along the street below. A city bus hissed to a stop beside a crosswalk. At exactly 1:18 p.m., Rebecca Sloan entered the lobby carrying a black leather folder, mid-40s, sharp gray suit, blonde hair tied back tight enough to look military. She shook Curtis's hand firmly. Mr. Hamilton, Curtis is fine. Rebecca studied him briefly while leading him toward a conference room. She had expected something different. Curtis recognized that immediately. Probably angry, defensive, loud. Instead, she got a man sitting straight-backed with controlled breathing and steady eyes. Inside the conference room, Rebecca opened Danielle's filing documents across the table. She's requesting temporary possession of the house during separation proceedings, Rebecca said calmly. There's also language here suggesting emotional intimidation. Curtis nodded once. I read it. Rebecca watched him carefully. You understand those claims matter in Colorado family court? Yes. You don't seem surprised. Curtis leaned back slightly. Surprised isn't useful. That answer made Rebecca pause. She flipped another page. She included statements about unpredictable behavior. Curtis looked directly at her. I've never hit my wife. I didn't say you had. She's implying it. Rebecca closed the folder halfway. Mr. Hamilton, I need complete honesty from this point forward. Any verbal incidents, threats, property, damage. Curtis shook his head once. No. Rebecca held his gaze for several seconds. Experienced lawyers developed instincts about people under pressure. Curtis could see her evaluating him the same way investigators once had during military debriefings. She believed him. Not emotionally, professionally. Finally, Rebecca nodded slowly. Okay. She slid a yellow legal pad across the table. Start documenting everything. Curtis looked down at the blank page. Everything? Texts, financial records, dates, changes in behavior, purchases, conversations. Save copies of anything public online. Rebecca's tone stayed flat and precise. Documentation beats emotion in court. Curtis almost smiled at that. The sentence sounded familiar. Military, tactical, practical. Rebecca noticed. You? Military. Army. What kind? Curtis hesitated briefly. Ranger Regiment. Rebecca blinked once. That explained the posture, the stillness, the absence of panic. You retired? Eventually. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Well, then you already understand chain of evidence. Curtis spent the next hour answering questions with exact times and details. Danielle's Denver trips, gym payments, the storage unit connected to Aspen Ridge Realty. Rebecca wrote notes quickly. At one point, she stopped. Did you ever confront her directly about the affair? No. Why not? Curtis looked toward the snow-covered mountains visible beyond the conference room windows. Confrontations mostly help the guilty prepare. Rebecca stared at him for a moment longer than before. When the meeting ended, she handed him a business card. From now on, don't react emotionally to anything either of them say. Curtis placed the card into his wallet. I wasn't planning to. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. That boyfriend of hers, Brandon Pierce. Curtis looked back at her. I've heard the name before recently. Curtis said nothing. There are rumors around town, Rebecca continued. Aggressive business practices, tax questions, lawsuits that disappeared strangely. Curtis absorbed the information without visible reaction. Rebecca opened the conference room door. One more thing, she said. Men like Brandon usually mistake patience for weakness. Curtis finally gave the faintest hint of a smile. Yeah, he said quietly. They usually do. That evening, Curtis stopped at Walmart and bought 3 external hard drives, a notebook, and 2 additional outdoor security cameras. Back at the house, he installed one camera overlooking the driveway and another facing the backyard gate. Legal placements, visible, everything time-stamped. Danielle arrived home around 8:30 p.m. She spotted the new camera above the garage immediately. What the hell is this security cameras? For what? Curtis tightened the final mounting screw calmly. Documentation. Danielle's expression shifted slightly. Not fear? Concern. You're seriously doing this? Curtis climbed down from the ladder. You filed legal paperwork. That doesn't mean you turned the house into a prison. Curtis packed the screwdriver back into its case. Everything stays transparent that way. Danielle stared at him hard. For the first time in months, Curtis noticed uncertainty behind her eyes. Not because he yelled, because he didn't. At 11:47 p.m., Curtis sat alone in the security office at Rocky Mountain Secure Storage, reviewing overnight delivery logs. The building hummed softly around him. Camera feeds flickered across 6 monitors. Then his personal phone rang. Unknown number. Colorado Springs area code. Curtis answered immediately. Curtis Hamilton? A deep, older voice responded after 2 seconds of silence. You still answer phones like somebody expecting bad news. Curtis froze. He hadn't heard that voice in 11 years. Colonel Victor Grayson, former commanding officer, former battlefield strategist, one of the only men Curtis ever trusted completely. Curtis sat up straighter automatically. Colonel, you still in Colorado Springs? Yes, sir. You busy tomorrow morning? Curtis glanced toward camera 6. Snow blew sideways across the storage lot outside. No, sir. Good, Grayson said calmly. Because I think your wife's new boyfriend just crossed into territory. He doesn't understand. The line went dead. Curtis arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. Iron Lantern Coffee sat just outside Peterson's Space Force Base, tucked between a dry cleaner and a gun store with faded American flags hanging in the windows. Most customers were Air Force personnel contractors or retired military men who still woke before sunrise without alarms. Snow lined the sidewalks in gray frozen piles. Curtis parked his old Ford beside a black Chevy Tahoe that looked recently washed despite the weather. Government plates. He recognized the vehicle before he stepped inside. Colonel Victor Grayson always drove black SUVs. Said lighter colors attracted unnecessary attention. Inside the cafe, country music played softly over hidden speakers. Espresso machines hissed behind the counter. Grayson sat alone in the back corner facing the entrance, still straight-backed at 68 years old. Silver hair cropped short, dark wool coat folded neatly beside him. His eyes moved first when Curtis approached, sharp, controlled, measuring. Some men lost authority after retirement. Grayson carried his like scar tissue. Curtis stopped beside the table. Sir. Grayson stood and shook his hand once. Good to see you alive, Hamilton. You too. They sat. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. That wasn't uncomfortable. Silence worked differently between soldiers. A waitress brought black coffee without asking Grayson what he wanted. Regular customer. Curtis noticed details automatically. 2 exits, 1 security camera above the register. Reflection visibility through the front glass. Old habits. Grayson watched him noticing everything. You still scan rooms. Curtis lifted his coffee. You taught me to. Grayson almost smiled. Outside traffic crawled slowly through morning snow along the boulevard. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. Finally, Grayson reached into his coat and placed a thin black USB drive on the table between them. Curtis looked down at it, but didn't touch it. What is it? A reason your wife's boyfriend should have stayed away from you. Curtis remained silent. Grayson leaned back slightly. You know Brandon Pierce owns more than a gym, I assumed. He runs 3 LLCs tied to veteran rehabilitation programs. Curtis frowned faintly. What kind of programs? Mostly fake ones. That landed quietly. Grayson continued. Federal grants, charity donations, public fundraising. He markets himself as some patriotic entrepreneur, helping struggling veterans rebuild discipline through fitness. Curtis stared through the cafe window. He remembered Brandon filming motivational videos constantly. American flags in the background. Gym photos with veterans. Fundraiser hashtags. People buy confidence, Grayson said. Especially loud confidence. Curtis finally picked up the USB drive. What does this have to do with Danielle Grayson's expression hardened slightly? Your wife's real estate company processed transfers connected to one of Pierce's shell corporations. Curtis looked up immediately. You sure? I don't deal in guesses anymore. Grayson slid a folded packet of printed documents across the table. bank routing numbers, property holding groups, transaction records. Curtis read them carefully. Aspen Ridge Realty appeared 3 times connected to an LLC named Frontier Wellness Initiative. Another company transferred money into Brandon Pierce Fitness Holdings less than 48 hours later. How much, Curtis asked. Just under $400,000 over 18 months. Curtis leaned back slowly. He didn't look angry. That worried Grayson more. "You think Danielle knew?" Curtis asked. Grayson answered carefully. "I think she knew enough to sign paperwork." Curtis stared down at the transaction sheets again. Military operations taught him something civilians rarely understood. Betrayal usually happened gradually. Tiny compromises first, then rationalizations, then full participation. "You're involved officially?" Curtis asked. Grayson nodded once. "Consulting for a private investigative group assisting federal auditors." "Since when 8 months?" Curtis almost laughed quietly at the timing. Danielle met Brandon around 7 months earlier. Grayson watched the realization settle. "Pierce targets appearance," he said. "Image. Public admiration. He likes crowds." Curtis thought about the neighborhood barbecue, the live stream videos, the loud engine, the constant need to dominate conversations. Predators often repeated patterns. "So, why contact me now?" Grayson folded his hands together. "Because Pierce started getting nervous recently." Curtis listened carefully. "One of his financial coordinators disappeared 2 weeks ago." Grayson continued. 3 internal accounts got frozen temporarily during an audit review. Since then, Pierce has been moving assets around aggressively. Curtis thought immediately about Storage Unit 214, late-night visits, after-hours access. Grayson noticed the shift in his expression. "You know something?" Curtis hesitated briefly. Then he explained the storage unit. The late-night entries, Danielle's company account, Brandon appearing repeatedly after midnight. Grayson listened without interrupting once. When Curtis finished, Grayson nodded slowly. "Good. Keep documenting. You think evidence is inside the unit?" "I think Pierce believes evidence might eventually need to disappear." Curtis took another sip of coffee. The bitterness barely registered. "What exactly are you asking me to do? Nothing illegal." Grayson's voice sharpened slightly. "That's important." Curtis gave a small nod. "Understood. I'm serious, Hamilton. No confrontations, no threats, no heroics." Grayson leaned forward now. Men like Pierce survive because emotional people hand them mistakes. Curtis looked directly at him. "I'm not emotional." "No," Grayson said quietly. "That's why I called you." The waitress returned with a plate of eggs and toast Curtis hadn't ordered. Grayson pointed at it. "You still forget to eat when stressed." Curtis almost smiled again. Some commanders remembered weaknesses better than birthdays. For several minutes, they ate in silence, while snow continued falling outside. Then Grayson spoke again without looking up. "You know what Pierce thinks you are?" Curtis cut into the eggs mechanically. "A security guard. He thinks you're embarrassed of your life." Curtis shrugged faintly. "Doesn't matter." "It does to him." Grayson wiped his hands carefully with a napkin. "Men built on ego need audiences. Pierce humiliates people publicly, because he thinks perception equals power. Curtis remembered Brandon standing across the cul-de-sac, smiling beside Danielle, while neighbors watched. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. "He'll escalate." "You sound certain." "I spent 30 years studying aggressive men with fragile identities." Grayson's tone stayed calm. "Pierce isn't dangerous because he's strong. He's dangerous because he needs witnesses." That sentence stayed with Curtis. At 9:42 a.m., they stepped outside into the freezing air. The parking lot glistened with dirty snow and reflected traffic lights. Grayson opened the rear door of the Tahoe briefly and removed a manila folder. He handed it to Curtis. Inside were photographs. Brandon with politicians. Brandon at veteran fundraisers. Brandon beside gym clients holding oversized donation checks. Then one final photograph. Danielle, standing beside Brandon, outside a downtown Denver hotel. Time stamped 3 months earlier. Curtis stared at it quietly. Danielle looked happy in the picture. Not guilty, not conflicted. Happy. Grayson watched his face carefully. "You okay?" Curtis closed the folder. "Doesn't matter. That's not what I asked." Curtis looked across the snowy parking lot toward his old Ford truck. For the first time since the divorce papers arrived, something heavy moved beneath the discipline. Not rage, loss. 15 years reduced into evidence folders and transaction records. "She used to hate fake people," Curtis said quietly. Grayson nodded once. People change when they start admiring attention more than character. A long silence followed. Then Grayson's expression hardened. Again. "One more thing." Curtis looked back at him. "Pierce has already tried intimidating 2 witnesses connected to this investigation." Curtis's eyes narrowed slightly. "How?" "Threats. Public humiliation. Aggressive confrontations." Curtis immediately thought about the note on his windshield. "She deserves better than this life." Grayson noticed the shift in his posture instantly. What Curtis told him about the note, about the neighborhood confrontation, about Brandon testing limits repeatedly. Grayson listened carefully. Then he gave a slow, grim nod. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He's building towards something." Curtis slipped the USB drive into his jacket pocket. Snowflakes drifted across the parking lot between them. "What do you want me to do now?" Grayson opened the driver's side door of the Tahoe. "Same thing you were trained to do overseas." Curtis waited. Grayson looked directly at him. "Stay calm while the other man loses control." Then he climbed into the SUV and shut the door. The black Tahoe pulled slowly onto the road and disappeared into Colorado Springs traffic. Curtis stood alone beside his truck for another minute. Cold wind moved through the parking lot. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A new Instagram notification. Brandon Pierce had just posted another video. Curtis opened it silently. Brandon stood inside his luxury gym, smiling into the camera beside Danielle. Caption: "Some men get replaced for a reason." Curtis watched the clip once. Then his eyes stopped on something in the background reflected through a glass office wall. A stack of black storage containers, with Rocky Mountain Secure storage labels still attached. The rooftop party started at 8 p.m. on a Friday in downtown Denver. By 8:17, Brandon Pierce was already live streaming. The event took place above the Halcyon Peak Hotel, overlooking the city skyline. Glass fire pits were burned blue against the November wind. Women in designer coats carried champagne flutes between heat lamps, while electronic music pulsed softly through hidden speakers. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked temporary. Curtis watched the live stream alone inside the security office at Rocky Mountain Secure Storage. Camera monitors glowed across the dark room, while snow pushed against the windows outside. A half-eaten turkey sandwich sat beside his keyboard, untouched. On Brandon's live stream, Danielle stood beside him, wearing a black dress Curtis had never seen before. "Everybody raise a glass," Brandon shouted into the camera. "To new beginnings." People cheered. Someone yelled, "Freedom!" Danielle laughed and lifted her champagne. Curtis noticed she already looked slightly drunk. Brandon swung the camera toward her dramatically. "So tell everybody," he said loudly, "what's the best part about upgrading your life?" A few people laughed immediately. Danielle covered her smile with one hand. "Brandon, no, seriously." He leaned closer with the phone. "You spent 15 years married to a guy who worked security at a storage facility. That deserves a recovery party." More laughter. Curtis sat motionless. The security office hummed quietly around him. Unit alarms blinked green across his monitor panel. Danielle took another sip of champagne before answering. "I guess I wasted too much time pretending stability was enough." Brandon grinned at the camera like a game show host. And now Danielle looked directly into the phone. "Now, I actually feel alive." Comments exploded across the live stream feed. "Queen energy. She traded up night shift, guy got replaced." Curtis watched every word without expression. Most men would have closed the video immediately. Curtis replayed it from the beginning instead. Military intelligence taught pattern recognition through repetition. Small details surfaced on second viewings. At 8:31 p.m., Brandon walked viewers through the rooftop crowd, introducing people loudly. Denver real estate, fitness investors, lifestyle branding, high-value people. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Danielle followed behind him, smiling carefully at the camera. Curtis noticed something else too. Brandon kept checking the viewer count every few seconds. Validation addiction. At 8:42 p.m., the live stream shifted toward a VIP seating section near the rooftop bar. Curtis leaned slightly closer to the screen. A black folder sat open on the glass table behind Brandon during part of the stream. Most viewers never would have noticed it. Curtis paused the video frame by frame. There, a logo partially visible on the folder corner. Silver mountain outline, blue lettering underneath. Frontier Wellness Initiative. The same shell organization Colonel Grayson mentioned that morning. Curtis replayed the clip again, slower. Danielle reached across the table briefly to move a champagne glass. For less than 1 second, paperwork beneath the folder became visible. Signature lines, financial tables, and Danielle's signature. Curtis paused the frame, zoomed in. Not perfectly clear, but enough. His eyes narrowed slightly. At 9:03 p.m., Tyler Jensen knocked lightly on the security office door. 19 years old, skinny, nervous energy. Worked weekend shifts part-time while attending community college. You good? Mr. Hamilton. Curtis minimized the live stream. Yeah. Tyler stepped inside carrying inventory sheets. Snow's getting bad outside. Curtis nodded once. Tyler hesitated awkwardly. You know that guy? Brandon Pierce. Curtis looked up immediately. Why? Tyler shifted uncomfortably. He came by earlier asking weird questions. What kind? About camera storage. Curtis stayed still. Tyler continued carefully. He asked how long footage stays archived. Said he was concerned about privacy issues. Curtis felt the first genuine warning signal all night. What exactly did you tell him? Nothing important, just standard retention policy. Curtis nodded once. Good. Tyler looked toward the computer monitor. Is that him? Curtis glanced at the paused live stream frame. Brandon stood smiling beside Danielle holding a whiskey glass. Yeah. Tyler frowned slightly. That dude gives off weird vibes. Curtis almost asked why. Then Tyler answered anyway. Like he's always performing for somebody. Curtis leaned back slowly. Interesting how often different people notice the same thing. After Tyler left, Curtis reopened the live stream recording. At 9:11 p.m., Brandon raised another toast. This one, he announced loudly, is dedicated to every man who refuses to settle for average. The crowd cheered again. Danielle laughed beside him, but Curtis noticed tension now around her eyes. Brandon enjoyed humiliation too much, even publicly, especially publicly. Curtis lowered the volume and started downloading the full live stream archive onto one of his new external hard drives. Time-stamped, backed up, organized. At 10:04 p.m., his phone rang. Rebecca Sloan. Curtis answered immediately. You watching the Denver circus? She asked. Yes. I've already archived copies. So did I. Rebecca sounded unsurprised. Good. Curtis told her about the Frontier Wellness folder appearing in the background. Silence followed briefly. Then Rebecca spoke carefully. Send me the timestamps. Curtis emailed them immediately. 2 minutes later, Rebecca called back. That logo matters. You recognize it? I recognize the audit investigation attached to it. Papers shuffled on her end. Curtis, do not contact Brandon directly. Don't warn Danielle either. I wasn't planning to. Good, because if they start destroying records now, we lose visibility. Curtis stared at the frozen video frame again. Danielle, smiling beside Brandon. Expensive rooftop lights reflecting behind them. You think she knows how serious this is? Rebecca hesitated. I think people ignore warning signs when somebody makes them feel important. That sentence stayed with him after the call ended. At 11:22 p.m., the live stream took a darker turn. Brandon was drunk now, not stumbling, but louder, crueler. He pointed the phone toward downtown Denver lights behind him. You know what kills most men? He asked his viewers dramatically. Comfort. People shouted agreement. Brandon smirked. That's why guys like Curtis Hamilton end up forgotten. They stop compsing. Danielle looked uncomfortable suddenly. Brandon? No, I'm serious. He wrapped one arm around her waist possessively. You gave that dude 15 years. 15. He looked directly into the camera. And he still works overnight security. Curtis watched, without blinking. Then Brandon laughed. Hell, my gym trainers make more money than that guy. The crowd laughed again. But Curtis noticed something important. Danielle didn't. Not this time. Instead, she glanced away toward the city skyline. Tiny fracture. At 11:39 p.m., the live stream ended abruptly. Curtis sat alone in the dim security office, listening to the building ventilation. Hum. Then he replayed the footage again from the beginning. This time, he focused only on background details, reflections, documents, people entering and leaving frame. At exactly 8:47 p.m., a man wearing a navy blazer briefly approached Brandon's VIP table. Older, balding, federal-style posture. Curtis paused the frame. The man quickly slid an envelope across the table before disappearing from camera view. Brandon tucked it beneath the Frontier Wellness folder. Immediately, Curtis zoomed closer. The envelope corner showed partial printed lettering. Denver District Audit Review. Curtis stared at the screen for several seconds. Then his work radio crackled suddenly. Unit C motion alert. Southwest corridor. Curtis stood immediately. Professional instinct switched on faster than thought. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the freezing hallway outside the office. Snow hammered against the metal building walls now. The storage facility looked deserted beneath security floodlights. Curtis moved through Building C silently. Concrete floors, cold air, rows of locked metal doors stretching into darkness. Halfway down the corridor, he stopped. Unit 214 stood slightly open. Only an inch, but open. Curtis slowly approached. No sound inside, all visible movement, and then he noticed something taped directly to the storage door. A printed screenshot from Brandon's live stream. Danielle smiling beside him. Across the photo, someone had written 3 words in thick black marker. You already lost. Curtis reached for the paper carefully. Then a metallic noise echoed deeper inside the unit. Something shifted in the darkness behind the partially open door. Curtis didn't reach for the storage door immediately. He stepped sideways first, out of direct line with the opening. Old training, never stand in front of unknown space. Snow rattled faintly against the metal roof overhead, while cold fluorescent lights buzzed across the corridor. Unit 214 remained open exactly 1 inch. The printed screenshot fluttered slightly against the steel door from the draft inside. You already lost. Curtis studied the gap carefully. No visible feet beneath the roll-up door. No breathing. No movement now, only darkness. His flashlight stayed lowered in his left hand. He touched the radio clipped to his jacket. Control check, he said calmly. Static answered. Then Tyler's sleepy voice crackled through. Copy. Any camera shuns down in Building C. A pause. No, sir. Keep recording backups active. Everything okay? Curtis looked at the partially open unit. For now. He ended transmission. Then he slowly pushed the door upward another 6 inches. Metal wheels rattled softly along the tracks. Inside sat stacked black storage containers exactly like the ones visible in Brandon's live stream. Plastic bins, filing boxes, folded gym banners leaning against the back wall. Nobody inside. Curtis stayed outside the threshold. Legally important. He could inspect for security concerns, but unauthorized entry crossed lines he understood too well. His flashlight swept carefully across visible surfaces. Nothing appeared disturbed except one overturned folding chair near the rear wall. Then he noticed fresh boot prints on the concrete floor, large, recent, snow melt still visible. One person entered. Nobody officially logged leaving. Curtis stepped back immediately. Interesting. Very interesting. He lowered the storage door without touching anything else. At 11:52 p.m., Curtis sat inside the security office, replaying camera footage from Building C monitor glow reflected across his face, while snowstorms buried the outer parking lot. Camera C-14 showed Brandon Pierce entering the building at 10:47 p.m. wearing a black hoodie and carrying something rectangular beneath his arm. At 10:51 p.m., Brandon unlocked Unit 214. At 11:06 p.m., another figure appeared. Danielle. White winter coat. Hair tied back, looking nervous. Curtis watched silently. Danielle entered the storage unit. 7 minutes later, she exited alone. Brandon remained inside. Curtis leaned closer. At 11:21 p.m., the corridor camera glitched briefly for less than 2 seconds. When the image stabilized, Brandon was gone. Curtis replayed the footage 3 more times. No visible exit. Which meant one thing. Someone accessed the emergency maintenance corridor behind the units. Employee-only access. Curtis immediately opened access logs. His expression hardened slightly. Maintenance corridor door C had been opened remotely at 11:19 p.m. using an employee override code. Tyler Jensen's code. Curtis stared at the screen. At 12:08 a.m., Tyler arrived at the security office carrying vending machine coffee and looking half awake. You called. Curtis rotated the monitor toward him. Tyler froze immediately. I didn't do that. Curtis watched him carefully. Tyler looked genuinely confused. That's my employee code, but I swear I didn't open anything. Curtis believed him instantly. Fear looked different from deception. Who knows your login? Curtis asked. Tyler swallowed hard. Nobody. Have you ever written it down? Tyler hesitated. Maybe once. In the break room drawer. Curtis leaned back slowly. Amateur mistake. Tyler looked toward the paused footage of Brandon. Is he trying to frame me? Curtis didn't answer immediately. Then, he's trying to erase visibility. Tyler shifted nervously. Should we call cops? Curtis considered it carefully. No. Tyler blinked. No, not yet. Curtis opened another camera angle. Parking lot east entrance. At 11:23 p.m., a dark SUV exited the rear gate during the exact window. Brandon disappeared from Building C. License plate partially obscured by snow. But the vehicle's shape looked familiar. Mercedes GLE. Danielle's car. Curtis saved the clip immediately, then duplicated it onto a second hard drive. Every step organized, time-stamped, layered. Military habit again. Never trust single copies. At 1:14 m, Tyler finally asked the question sitting visibly in his head. "Mr. Hamilton, why are you so calm?" Curtis kept reviewing footage while answering. "Because panic creates mistakes." Tyler looked unconvinced. "If somebody was sleeping with my wife and threatening me, I'd lose my mind." Curtis finally looked at him. "Maybe," Tyler frowned. Curtis continued quietly. "But losing control is usually exactly what the other person wants." That stayed in the room for several seconds. Then Tyler nodded slowly, like he was hearing something older than advice. At 2:03 a.m., Curtis received another Instagram notification. Brandon Pierce had uploaded a new story. Curtis opened it. Brandon stood shirtless inside his luxury gym, flexing beside mirrors, while loud music blasted behind him. Text across the screen. "Some men hide in the dark. Some men take what they want." Curtis noticed bruising across Brandon's knuckles. Interesting. The next clip showed Danielle sitting near the gym office, drinking wine, while Brandon filmed himself. She didn't know he was recording her at first. For a brief second, her expression looked exhausted. Then Brandon pointed the camera toward her, and she immediately smiled again. Performance again. Curtis replayed that moment twice. People revealed themselves in transitions, not poses. At 3:26 a.m., snow finally stopped. Colorado Springs fell quiet beneath freezing fog and streetlights. Curtis finished compiling a private evidence folder, live stream recordings, camera footage, access logs, time-stamped screenshots, visitor entries, vehicle exits. He encrypted copies and sent them securely to Rebecca Sloan. Then he hesitated before sending another file separately to Colonel Victor Grayson. Subject line: Maintenance corridor access. Grayson replied 12 minutes later with only 4 words. He's getting desperate now. Curtis sat alone in the dim office afterward, listening to the building settle around him. Somewhere down the hallway, metal expanded softly from temperature shifts. His phone buzzed again. Danielle this time. Curtis answered. Silence at first. Then her voice. "You need to stop digging." Curtis leaned back slowly. "I'm not digging." "Yes, you are." Background noise echoed behind her. Gym music, male voices. Brandon nearby somewhere. Curtis noticed she sounded nervous for the first time in months. "You don't understand what's happening," Danielle whispered. "No," Curtis said calmly. "I think I do." A long pause followed. Then Danielle lowered her voice even more. "Brandon says you're trying to ruin him." Curtis almost smiled at the wording. "Not us. Him. I haven't contacted Brandon once," Curtis said. "He thinks you're recording things." Curtis glanced toward the hard drives beside his keyboard. Another silence. Then Danielle spoke carefully. "You should let this go." Curtis stared at camera C-1, 4 showing the empty corridor outside Unit 214. "You know what I think," he said quietly. Danielle didn't answer. "I think Brandon's scared." Her breathing changed slightly. Tiny detail, but noticeable. "You don't know him," she said. Curtis looked at the frozen frame, showing Brandon slipping through the maintenance corridor. No, Curtis replied calmly. I know exactly his type. Danielle suddenly sounded angry again, almost relieved to return there. You always do this. Do what you sit there acting smarter than everybody else while your life falls apart. Curtis let the words pass. Danielle exhaled sharply. Then one final sentence slipped out before she hung up. You should have just stayed invisible. The line went dead. Curtis sat motionless for several seconds afterward. Invisible. That word mattered, because Brandon clearly believed the same thing Danielle did. That Curtis Hamilton was background noise. Night security, quiet husband, forgettable man. Curtis opened the parking lot camera feed again. Then he stopped. A figure stood outside the front security gate. Tall, broad shoulders, hands inside hoodie pockets. Brandon Pierce, just standing there beneath the security light at 3:51 a.m., watching the building, watching Curtis's office window, and slowly smiling. Brandon Pierce came back 3 nights later, not during business hours, not when managers or customers filled the property. He arrived at 1:38 a.m. during the dead stretch of Curtis's overnight shift, when the storage facility sat buried under silence and freezing Colorado wind. Curtis saw the black Dodge Hellcat enter through the south gate before the engine noise even reached the building. Too fast, too aggressive. Floodlights reflected across wet asphalt as the car slid sideways slightly before stopping near Building C. Curtis remained seated inside the security office. Monitor glow lit the room blue. Coffee steamed beside his keyboard, untouched. He watched Brandon climb out, wearing a black bomber jacket despite the cold. No gym clothes tonight. No social media smile. Just agitation. Curtis noticed another thing immediately. Brandon came alone. That mattered. People who performed for crowds behaved differently in private. Curtis pressed one button beneath the desk. Parking lot audio recording active. Then another. External camera archive backup active. At 1:41 a.m., Brandon yanked open the office door without knocking. Cold air flooded inside with him. You got a second? Brandon asked. His tone already carried confrontation. Curtis leaned back slightly in his chair. Depends. Brandon shut the door behind him harder than necessary and looked around the office. Security monitors, logbooks, clock on the wall. He smiled faintly. So this is where the magic happens. Curtis said nothing. Brandon stepped closer to the desk. You recording me right now? Curtis looked directly at him. All public areas are monitored. That's not what I asked. Curtis folded his hands calmly. What do you want, Brandon? The direct use of his name shifted something slightly. Brandon walked toward the monitors, displaying camera feeds. From Building C, snow drifted through the empty corridors on screen. You've been digging around my business. No. Bullshit. Curtis stayed still. Brandon turned around sharply. You think I don't know about the logs? The screens? It's talking to lawyers. Curtis noticed Brandon's breathing. Fast, unstable. Not drunk. Worried. Interesting. You came here at almost 2 in the morning, Curtis said quietly. That usually means somebody's nervous. For the first time, Brandon's expression cracked slightly. Then anger covered it immediately. You know what your problem is, Brandon snapped. You think staying calm makes you smarter than everybody. Curtis remembered nearly identical words from Danielle. Same phrasing, meaning Brandon had been talking about him constantly. Curtis looked toward the security camera mounted above the office entrance. Visible, intentional. Then back at Brandon. You should leave. Brandon laughed once. No. We're finally having the conversation you've been avoiding. Curtis remained seated. Outside wind pushed snow against the metal walls with hollow scraping sounds. Brandon stepped closer. You think Danielle still respects you? He asked. She doesn't even talk about you like a man anymore. Curtis gave no reaction. That irritated Brandon immediately. She feels sorry for you. Nothing. You know what she calls you? Curtis looked at him steadily. Probably depends on the day. Brandon smiled sharply. There he is. Tiny little jokes. He leaned forward across the desk. You know why people walk over you because you let them. Curtis studied him carefully now. The expensive watch, dilated pupils, jaw tension, micro tremor in the right hand. Brandon wasn't here to intimidate anymore. He was here to confirm whether Curtis knew something dangerous. What exactly are you worried? I found Curtis asked calmly. That hit harder than yelling would have. Brandon froze for half a second. Then his face darkened. You think you're clever. Curtis said nothing. Brandon suddenly slammed both hands onto the desk. Coffee spilled sideways across paperwork. You need to stop asking questions. The shout echoed through the office. Curtis didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't rise from the chair. Brandon noticed that too, and it bothered him. Most people reacted to volume automatically. Curtis treated it like weather. You done? Curtis asked quietly. Brandon stared at him in disbelief. What is wrong with you? Curtis leaned back slightly. You came here looking for a reaction. Brandon's nostrils flared. You think this is a game? No, Curtis replied. I think you're losing control. The silence afterward felt dangerous. Brandon took one slow step around the desk now. Closer. Inside personal space. Curtis noticed the smell of whiskey beneath expensive cologne. You know, Brandon said softly, guys like you always break eventually. Curtis looked up at him from the chair. Guys like me. Quiet guys, repressed guys. Eventually, all that buried anger comes out. Curtis almost smiled at that. Brandon mistook discipline for suppression. A common mistake. You don't know anything about me, Curtis said. Brandon leaned closer. I know Danielle spent years pretending you were enough. There it was again. Performance language. Winning language. Not relationship language. Curtis's eyes shifted briefly toward the corner camera. Brandon followed the glance immediately. Then he smiled slowly. Oh, Brandon said, now I get it. Curtis stayed silent. You want me on camera. Curtis neither confirmed nor denied it. Brandon laughed softly. That's smart. He stepped backward for the first time since entering. Then his expression changed completely. Calmer now. More calculating. You know people in this town, Curtis? Curtis watched him carefully. Some? I know deputies. Brandon shrugged casually. Business owners? Sponsors? Politicians? Curtis heard the hidden message underneath it. Influence, pressure, protection. Brandon spread his hands slightly. You really think anybody's going to side with the overnight security guy over me? Curtis answered immediately. I think evidence sides with itself. That sentence landed hard. Brandon's smile disappeared. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Only the hum of surveillance monitors filled the office. Then Brandon suddenly reached down and shoved Curtis's shoulder hard. Not enough to injure, enough to provoke, enough to test. Curtis's chair rolled backward 6 inches across the concrete floor. Brandon waited. Curtis remained seated. No reaction, not even anger. That unsettled Brandon more than resistance would have. You serious? Brandon asked quietly. Curtis looked directly into his eyes. You should leave now. The words came calm, certain, final. Brandon's jaw tightened visibly. You think you're better than me, no? Then what is it? Curtis stood slowly. For the first time, the difference in presence changed the room immediately. Curtis wasn't bigger than Brandon, but he moved differently, balanced, controlled. Like violence existed somewhere far behind the eyes, but remained locked under heavy doors. Brandon noticed. Curtis stepped sideways intentionally, so the camera captured both of them fully. You came onto private property after hours, Curtis said evenly. You threatened me. You touched me first. Now leave. Brandon stared at him. Something uncertain flickered underneath the ego for the first time. Then pride buried it again. This isn't over. Curtis nodded once. I know. Brandon backed toward the door slowly, then stopped with one hand on the handle. You know what Danielle said about you yesterday? Curtis waited. She said you disappeared years before she cheated. Curtis's expression didn't change, but something cold settled deeper inside him. Brandon smiled again, sensing he finally hit something. There it is, he whispered. Knew you were still in there somewhere. Then he opened the door and stepped into the freezing night. Curtis watched through the office window as Brandon crossed the parking lot beneath white security lights. Snow crunched under his boots. Halfway to the Hellcat, Brandon stopped and looked back toward the building. Then he lifted one hand slowly and pointed directly at Curtis through the glass. Not a threat, a promise. Seconds later, the Hellcat roared out through the south gate and disappeared into the darkness beyond the highway. Curtis remained standing beside the desk. Coffee dripped slowly from the paperwork onto the concrete floor. His phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca Sloan. Court hearing moved to Monday morning. Danielle requesting temporary restraining order. Curtis stared at the message. Then another notification arrived immediately after. Unknown number, 1 sentence only. Sooner or later, I'll make you swing first. Curtis looked up toward the camera still recording above the office door, then quietly saved the footage under a new file name. Brandon Pierce, Threat Contact Number 1. The hearing took place Monday morning inside the El Paso County Courthouse in downtown Colorado Springs. Gray sky, wet sidewalks, American flags snapping sharply in freezing wind outside the entrance. Curtis arrived 23 minutes early, wearing a charcoal suit he hadn't touched in years. The jacket fit slightly looser now around the waist. Rebecca Sloan walked beside him carrying 2 legal folders and a tablet filled with evidence files. "You sleep at all?" she asked quietly. "Enough." Rebecca glanced sideways at him. Most clients unraveled before hearings like this. Angry texts, emotional calls, panic. Curtis simply documented everything. That alone made him dangerous. Inside the courthouse, fluorescent lights washed pale color across marble floors. Lawyers moved quickly between courtrooms, carrying coffee and tension. Danielle already sat near courtroom 4B when Curtis entered. Black blazer, hair perfectly styled, expression carefully arranged somewhere between wounded and composed. Brandon sat directly behind her, wearing an expensive navy coat and a confident smile. He looked comfortable in public spaces, especially ones with audiences. Curtis noticed Brandon immediately lean toward Danielle and whisper something while looking directly at him. Danielle didn't smile back this time. Interesting. Rebecca touched Curtis's arm lightly before they entered. "Remember something?" Curtis looked at her. Family court judges hear emotional performances every day. Calm matters. Curtis nodded once. "I know." Rebecca studied him for another second. "I mean real calm, not military interrogation calm." Curtis almost smiled faintly. Then they entered the courtroom. Judge Ellen Markham presided from the elevated bench precisely at 9 a.m., mid-60s. Sharp reading glasses. Reputation for disliking theatrics. Good. Curtis sat quietly beside Rebecca, while Danielle's attorney, Martin Cole, organized papers dramatically across his table. Cole stood first. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hamilton seeks temporary protection due to escalating emotional intimidation, son, from Mr. Hamilton following marital separation." Curtis watched Danielle carefully, not with anger, observation. She avoided looking directly at him. Cole continued smoothly. "Mrs. Hamilton reports persistent surveillance behaviors, security monitoring, and emotional pressure creating fear within the marital residence." Fear again. That word kept returning. Judge Markham adjusted her glasses. "Specific incidents?" Cole nodded immediately. "Installation of surveillance devices at the marital home. Repeated monitoring behaviors. Aggressive presence." Rebecca wrote one sentence on her legal pad and slid it toward Curtis. "Let him overstate." Curtis remained still. Danielle finally testified. Her voice sounded controlled at first. "Curtis changed after I asked for separation," she said softly. "He became cold, watchful." Judge Markham looked up. "Did he threaten you physically?" Danielle hesitated. Tiny delay. "No." but it felt implied. Rebecca's pen stopped moving immediately. Important answer. Cole stepped closer to Danielle gently. How did his behavior affect you emotionally? Danielle lowered her eyes. I stopped feeling safe in my own home. Curtis watched her carefully. Not because he doubted she believed some version of that. People often rewrote emotional discomfort into fear when guilt entered the picture. Then Brandon took the stand voluntarily. Rebecca's expression sharpened instantly. Interesting mistake. Brandon sat confidently and crossed one ankle over his knee, like he was appearing on a podcast instead of in court. Mr. Pierce Cole began. Have you personally observed concerning behavior from Mr. Hamilton? Oh, absolutely. Brandon spoke too fast, too eager. He follows Danielle around emotionally, watches people, shows up places unexpectedly. Curtis noticed Judge Markham's expression shift slightly. Not convinced. Brandon continued anyway. He's one of those quiet guys where you can feel anger underneath everything. Rebecca finally stood. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine granted. Rebecca approached slowly with a single printed folder. Mr. Pierce, she said calmly, you visited Rocky Mountain Secure Storage on November 11th at approximately 1:38 a.m., correct? Brandon blinked once. What does that have to do with yes or no? Yes. You confronted Mr. Hamilton inside his workplace. I had a conversation with him. Rebecca opened the folder. You shoved him, correct? No. Rebecca pressed a button on her tablet. The courtroom speakers activated immediately. Video appeared on the courtroom monitor. Security footage. Clear angle. Timestamp visible. Brandon leaning across the desk, shouting. Coffee spilling. Then the shove. Sharp. Obvious. The courtroom fell completely silent. Curtis watched Brandon's face instead of the screen. That mattered more. For the first time since meeting him, Brandon looked uncertain. Rebecca paused the video exactly as Brandon's hand struck Curtis's shoulder. You were saying... Brandon shifted in his seat. He provoked me. How? He kept baiting me. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. By sitting in a chair, a few people inside the courtroom glanced at each other. Judge Markham looked openly irritated now. Rebecca continued calmly. You also sent the following text message approximately 12 minutes after leaving the property. Another screen appeared. Sooner or later, I'll make you swing first. Brandon's jaw tightened visibly. That's taken out of context. Rebecca didn't even acknowledge the response. Mr. Pierce, are you aware that Colorado is a one-party consent recording state? Brandon frowned. What? Meaning Mr. Hamilton legally recorded your interaction. That landed hard. Curtis saw it instantly. Brandon thought emotionally, not strategically. Rebecca stepped closer now. You repeatedly initiated contact with my client despite no contact requests. Correct, no. She displayed call logs, parking lot footage, visitor entries, time-stamped interactions, every piece layered carefully. Curtis recognized the structure immediately. Rebecca built cases the same way military analysts built operational briefings. No emotion. Just sequence. Judge Markham leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce," she said sharply, "did you or did you not physically confront Mr. Hamilton at his workplace after midnight?" Brandon hesitated too long. "Yes." The judge's expression hardened. Rebecca returned calmly to her table, then stood again, almost immediately. "One additional matter, Your Honor." She handed documents to the court clerk. "We request permission to introduce preliminary financial evidence relevant to credibility and witness intimidation concerns." Martin Cole objected instantly. "Relevance." Rebecca's voice remained calm. "The witness currently accusing my client of instability is under active scrutiny connected to financial irregularities involving Frontier Wellness Initiative." That changed the room immediately. Brandon straightened sharply. Danielle finally looked directly at Curtis for the first time all morning. Fear now. Real fear. Judge Markham scanned the documents briefly. "Is there an active criminal investigation?" Rebecca chose her wording carefully. "There are ongoing financial reviews involving entities connected to Mr. Pierce." Brandon stood suddenly. "This is bullshit." Judge Markham's voice cut through the courtroom instantly. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce." Brandon hesitated. "Big mistake." Court officers near the wall shifted slightly. Finally, Brandon sat again, but anger radiated off him visibly now. Rebecca remained perfectly composed. "Your Honor, my client has not threatened, assaulted, or harassed anyone. The documented pattern actually shows repeated provocation directed toward him." Judge Markham removed her glasses slowly. Then she looked directly at Curtis for the first time. "Mr. Hamilton?" Curtis stood immediately. "You understand why these proceedings matter?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You have military background?" "Yes." "Then you understand restraint." Curtis answered calmly. "Yes, ma'am." Judge Markham studied him for several seconds. Not just his words, his posture, breathing, control. Then she looked toward Brandon, who now looked furious enough to explode. Decision made itself. "The temporary restraining request is denied pending further review." Danielle's face lost color immediately. Brandon muttered something under his breath. Judge Markham continued. "Both parties will maintain distance and avoid unnecessary contact moving forward." Then she looked sharply at Brandon again. "That includes you, Mr. Pierce." Outside the courtroom afterward, reporters moved through nearby hallways, covering unrelated cases. Lawyers rushed past, carrying folders and coffee cups. Curtis and Rebecca walked toward the elevators quietly. "You did well," Rebecca said. Curtis adjusted his jacket, felt straightforward. Rebecca actually laughed softly once. Most people implode under false accusations. Curtis looked ahead. Most people react emotionally. Rebecca stopped near the elevator doors. "Curtis!" He looked at her. That financial evidence rattled him badly. Curtis nodded once. "I noticed." Rebecca lowered her voice and scared Danielle. Before Curtis could answer, loud footsteps echoed behind them. Brandon. Fast, angry. "Hey!" Rebecca turned immediately. Brandon pointed directly at Curtis across the courthouse hallway. "This isn't over." Several people nearby stopped walking, watching. Audience again. Curtis stayed completely still. Brandon stepped closer. You think hiding behind lawyers makes you tough? Rebecca moved slightly between them, but Curtis gently touched her arm once. Then he looked directly at Brandon. Calm, cold, controlled. You're falling apart in public now, Curtis said quietly. Brandon froze. That sentence hit deeper than any insult could have. For one dangerous second, Curtis thought Brandon might actually swing inside the courthouse hallway. Instead, Brandon leaned closer and whispered, "You have no idea what's coming." Then he walked away. Danielle followed him several seconds later without looking back once. Rebecca watched them disappear around the corner. Then she exhaled slowly. He's escalating faster than I expected. Curtis stared down the empty hallway.
Yes, he said, quietly. He is. Then his phone vibrated. A no number. One text. Meet me outside McKenna's Friday night. No audience restrictions this time. Curtis stopped sleeping well after the courthouse hearing. Not because of fear, because patterns were accelerating. People under pressure made faster mistakes. And Brandon Pierce was starting to move too quickly. Wednesday night, freezing rain coated Colorado Springs in sheets of dirty ice. Streetlights reflected gold across wet pavement outside Rocky Mountain's secure storage. While Curtis sat alone in the security office, reviewing financial spreadsheets Rebecca Sloan had forwarded earlier that afternoon. The deeper he looked, the uglier it became. Frontier Wellness Initiative wasn't just moving charity money. It was washing it clean. Shell companies received veteran outreach grants, then redirected funds through consulting firms, equipment purchases, and real estate holding groups. Danielle's company appeared repeatedly in property transfers connected to abandoned commercial spaces Brandon later used for temporary fitness recovery centers. Most of the buildings stayed empty, but the money moved anyway. Curtis studied the numbers quietly. Military operations taught him logistics before combat. Supply chains revealed truth faster than speeches ever could. One transaction caught his attention immediately. $87,400 transferred from Frontier Wellness Initiative into Aspen Ridge Realty 18 months earlier. Description: property rehabilitation support. 3 days later, nearly the exact amount moved into Pierce Elite Performance LLC. Curtis leaned back slowly. Danielle signed the authorization form personally. He stared at her digital signature for a long time. Not because it shocked him anymore, because it answered something worse. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. This was participation. His phone buzzed on the desk. Rebecca Sloan. "You looking at the files?" she asked immediately. "Yes." You see the transfer loops Curtis watched, rain slide down the security office windows. "Yeah." Rebecca exhaled quietly. "We pulled preliminary audit records from Denver this afternoon. Brandon's charity listed rehabilitation programs for injured veterans that may not actually exist. How much money? At least $2.3 million. Over 3 years. Curtis remained silent. Rebecca continued carefully. "There's more." Curtis waited. Danielle's signature appears on 6 separate property transactions
connected to those programs. Curtis closed his eyes briefly. Not from anger. Calculation. Memory. He remembered Danielle suddenly becoming interested in investment opportunities almost 2 years earlier. Remembered Brandon appearing around the same period talking about patriotic business branding and veteran recovery programs. At the time, Curtis barely paid attention. He trusted her. That's the worst part, Rebecca said quietly, almost reading his thoughts. People like Brandon don't start by asking others to commit crimes. They start by making them feel important. Curtis looked toward the frozen parking lot outside. I should have seen it earlier. No, Rebecca corrected immediately. You should have expected your wife to act like your wife. That sentence stayed with him after the call ended. At 1:11 a.m., Colonel Victor Grayson arrived unexpectedly. The black Tahoe rolled through the gate without warning and parked beneath the floodlights outside the office. Curtis opened the door before Grayson even knocked. You look tired, the colonel said immediately. Long week. Grayson stepped inside carrying another folder. His expression looked harder tonight. More urgent. What happened? Curtis asked. Grayson dropped the folder onto the desk. Federal auditors interviewed one of Pierce's former accountants yesterday. Curtis sat down slowly. And he's cooperating. That mattered. People like Brandon survived through loyalty and intimidation. Once insiders started talking, structures collapsed fast. Grayson opened the folder. Inside sat photographs of several commercial properties across Colorado and Wyoming. Empty gyms, unused therapy centers, storage warehouses. These are all tied to Frontier Wellness Initiative, Grayson explained. Most were used temporarily to justify grant money. Curtis studied the images carefully. One photo stopped him. A converted warehouse in Denver. Black storage containers visible near the loading dock. Rocky Mountain secure storage labels still attached. Same containers from Brandon's live stream. Same containers from Unit 214. Grayson noticed Curtis recognizing them. You see the connection now? Curtis nodded once. They're moving records through storage units. Exactly. Grayson leaned forward slightly. And Pierce knows somebody's getting close. Curtis looked up. You think that's why he keeps pushing me? Yes. Grayson's answer came instantly. He doesn't understand your personality. So he's defaulting to intimidation. Curtis almost smiled faintly. Common mistake again. Grayson folded his hands together. Men like Pierce think every man has a breaking point attached to ego. Curtis looked toward the dark camera monitors lining the wall. He keeps trying to make this physical. Because physical conflict creates chaos. Grayson's voice stayed calm. Chaos destroys timelines. Evidence disappears inside emotional situations. Curtis understood immediately. If Curtis ever hit Brandon first, everything changed. The quiet military veteran suddenly became the unstable husband. Every accusation gained credibility. Grayson watched the realization settle fully. That's the trap. Curtis nodded slowly. Outside, freezing rain rattled against the building roof, harder now. The office lights hummed softly above them. Then Grayson said something unexpected. "You know why I trusted you overseas?" Curtis looked at him. "Because you never confused anger with strength." The words landed heavier than compliments usually did. Curtis remembered Afghanistan suddenly. Dust storms, radio static. 20-year-old soldiers panicking during ambushes, while Grayson's voice stayed calm through the headset. Emotion killed discipline. Discipline kept men alive. His phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Another text from Brandon. "Friday, McKenna's. Don't hide behind lawyers this time." Grayson saw the message over Curtis's shoulder. "He invited you somewhere public." Curtis nodded once. Grayson leaned back, slowly. "Good." Curtis frowned slightly. Good public places have witnesses. Curtis studied him carefully. "You want me to go?" "I want Pierce predictable." That answer felt military again. Controlled battlefield. Known terrain. Grayson stood and walked toward the office window, overlooking the frozen parking lot. Pierce built his entire identity around dominance, he said quietly. When people like that start losing control, they become desperate for public victories. Curtis looked down at the newest text. Then another message arrived immediately after. "Danielle this time. Please don't go Friday." Interesting. Very interesting. Curtis opened the message fully. "Brandon's angry after court. Just stay away from him." Curtis stared at the screen. No apology, no accountability. Just warning. Grayson noticed his expression. What Curtis showed him the message. The colonel read it once and nodded slowly. She's scared now. Of him, of consequences. Big difference. Curtis leaned back in the chair again. Rainwater streaked across the windows behind Grayson, while snow mixed into the storm outside. "You think she knew how far this went?" Curtis asked quietly. Grayson considered carefully before answering. "I think Danielle liked the lifestyle first." He paused. Then she ignored the warning signs because admitting the truth would have cost her too much. Curtis looked down at the financial records again. $2.3 million. Fake veteran programs. Fraud. And Danielle, somewhere in the middle, pretending it wasn't happening. At 2:07 a.m., Tyler Jensen entered the office carrying fresh coffee. He froze slightly, seeing Grayson. The colonel's presence did that to people automatically. Curtis introduced them briefly. Tyler handed over the coffee nervously. There's something else." Curtis looked up immediately. What? Tyler swallowed. "That Hellcat came by again earlier." Curtis's expression stayed neutral. "When?" "About 40 minutes ago." Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. Tyler continued. "He didn't come inside this time. Just parked outside the south gate for like 10 minutes. Alone." "Yeah." Curtis exchanged one brief glance with Grayson. Watching behavior. Surveillance behavior now. Brandon was unraveling faster. Tyler hesitated again. He looked angry. Grayson finally spoke. "Angry men are predictable men." Tyler looked confused. Curtis understood perfectly. At 2:31 a.m., after Tyler left, Grayson gathered his folders to leave. At the door, he stopped. One more thing. Curtis looked up. If Pierce contacts you again before Friday, document everything. Grayson's voice lowered slightly. And if he challenges you publicly, Curtis waited. The colonel's eyes hardened. Make sure there are cameras. Then he stepped out into the freezing Colorado night and disappeared toward the waiting black Tahoe. Curtis stood alone in the office afterward, listening to the storm outside. His phone buzzed one final time before dawn. Another message from Brandon, this time with a photo attached. Danielle asleep on a hotel bed beside scattered cash bundles and open champagne bottles. Caption: You really think she still belongs to you? Curtis stared at the image for several seconds. Then his eyes shifted to the background reflection in the hotel mirror. Black document boxes, Frontier Wellness labels, and a partially visible federal subpoena sitting open on the desk behind them. Friday night arrived under hard winter wind and clear black skies over Colorado Springs. McKenna's Steakhouse sat near the northern edge of downtown, the kind of expensive restaurant built for businessmen who liked dark wood interiors, oversized whiskey collections, and valet parking under glowing heat lamps. By 7:12 p.m., the parking lot was already full. Curtis arrived alone in his old silver Ford F-150. No dramatic entrance, no polished image. He parked beneath a flickering street lamp across the road and shut off the engine quietly. For a moment he stayed seated, watching. Military habit again. The steakhouse windows reflected amber light onto wet pavement, while customers moved inside carrying winter coats and wine bottles. Expensive UVs lined the valet lane. Then Curtis noticed the black Chevy Tahoe, parked half a block away beneath a dead traffic light, engine running. Colonel Victor Grayson sat behind the wheel. Curtis didn't react visibly, but he understood immediately. Observation post, witness position, everything tonight mattered. His phone buzzed. Rebecca Sloan. You there yet? Yes. Remember something, Curtis? He watched two businessmen laugh near the restaurant entrance. I know. No, Rebecca said sharply. Listen carefully. Brandon wants emotional footage. Don't give him any. Curtis looked toward the Tahoe again. Understood. And Curtis, yes. If he touches you first, every camera becomes your witness. The call ended. Curtis stepped out into the freezing night air. His boots crunched lightly over salt-covered pavement, while wind carried the smell of grilled meat and cigar smoke from the restaurant patio. Inside, McKenna's soft jazz played beneath low conversation. Danielle sat immediately visible near the center dining area beside Brandon. Private booth. Wine bottle open. Danielle wore a dark green dress Curtis remembered buying for an anniversary dinner 3 years earlier. Brandon spotted Curtis first. Of course he did. People obsessed with dominance constantly scanned rooms. A slow smile spread across Brandon's face. Danielle turned next. For half a second, real fear crossed her expression. Then Brandon leaned toward her and said something quietly. She looked down at the table immediately afterward. Curtis approached calmly, carrying a sealed manila envelope Rebecca prepared earlier containing financial disclosure documents. No threats, no confrontation, just legal paperwork. A hostess intercepted him politely. "Sir, do you have a reservation?" Curtis handed her the envelope. "Delivery for Danielle Hamilton." Brandon stood before the hostess could respond. "Well, look who finally showed up." Several nearby tables glanced over immediately. "Audience acquired." Curtis remained calm. "Legal documents," he said evenly. Brandon ignored the envelope completely. Instead, he spread his arms theatrically. "Everybody relax," he announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. Danielle's ex-husband just came to say hello. Curtis noticed phones lifting subtly around the room already. People loved public conflict, especially expensive restaurants filled with bored strangers. Danielle spoke quietly. "Brandon, stop." He ignored her too. Curtis handed the envelope directly to Danielle. "Rebecca asked me to deliver this tonight." Danielle took it reluctantly. Her fingers shook slightly. Brandon smirked. "That lawyer of yours always hiding behind paperwork." Curtis looked directly at him. "Paperwork lasts longer than talking." Several nearby people exchanged glances at that. Brandon's smile tightened. "You know what your problem is, Curtis?" he asked loudly. "You think acting calm makes you superior." Curtis has said nothing. That irritated Brandon instantly. Seriously, Brandon continued, stepping away from the booth now. "Do you even feel anything?" Curtis watched him carefully. The signs were all there now. Fast breathing, jaw tension, overperformance, alcohol mixed with panic. Dangerous combination. Danielle stood suddenly. "Brandon, let's just go." "No," one word. Sharp, possessive. Curtis noticed Danielle flinch slightly at the tone. Interesting. Brandon stepped closer now. "Actually," he said, "I'm tired of this guy pretending he's above everybody." Curtis remained still. Restaurant conversations had nearly stopped around them now. Phones, definitely recording openly. Perfect. Brandon pointed toward the entrance. "Come outside." Curtis didn't move. Brandon laughed harshly. "There it is." "Knew it." Curtis finally answered. "I'm not here for this." "Oh, but I am." Brandon shoved a chair aside with unnecessary force and started toward the exit. Then he looked back over his shoulder. "What's wrong?" he shouted. "Don't want to embarrass yourself in front of your wife." Danielle grabbed Brandon's sleeve. "Stop it." He pulled away immediately. Curtis noticed something important then. Danielle wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was nervous. Actually nervous. Brandon pushed through the restaurant doors into the freezing night. People near the windows turned openly now to watch outside. Curtis stood motionless for 2 seconds. Then he followed. Not because Brandon challenged him, because walking away now would only escalate pursuit later. Outside, wind cut sharply between buildings. The valet stand lights reflected off wet asphalt, while traffic moved slowly down the street beyond the restaurant. Brandon stood in the middle of the sidewalk, removing his watch dramatically, exactly like a man performing for cameras. A crowd had already formed near the entrance. Valets, restaurant guests, pedestrians slowing down, phones raised everywhere. Curtis stopped several feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, open posture, non-threatening. Across the street, the black Tahoe remained idling silently. Grayson watching everything. Brandon pointed directly at Curtis. "You've been acting tough online, through lawyers and cameras." Curtis answered calmly. "I haven't contacted you once." "Bullshit. You came to my workplace." Brandon stepped closer. "You think I'm scared of you?" Curtis noticed Danielle emerge from the restaurant entrance behind them, her face pale now. "Brandon, let's leave." He ignored her completely. "Everybody thinks you're some quiet badass," Brandon shouted. "But you're just a washed-up security guard." Curtis said nothing. The silence started working against Brandon again. People in the crowd noticed it too. One man trying desperately to create conflict. One man refusing it completely. Brandon suddenly spread his arms wide. "What, you won't fight me?" Curtis looked directly at him. "No." The answer landed harder than aggression would have. A few people in the crowd actually laughed softly. Brandon heard it. Humiliation flashed across his face instantly. Dangerous moment. Very dangerous. "You think saying no makes you strong?" Brandon snapped. Curtis remained still. "You're drunk," he said calmly. "Go home." That sentence broke something. Not physically. Psychologically. Brandon lunged forward suddenly and shoved Curtis hard in the chest. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Curtis stepped backward once to absorb momentum. Didn't retaliate. Didn't raise his hands. Phones captured everything. Danielle shouted Brandon's name sharply. Brandon pointed at Curtis again. "There. There he is." Curtis kept his voice level. "You already touched me first." Brandon's breathing turned ragged now. The audience wasn't reacting the way he expected. Nobody saw a dominant alpha male. They saw an unstable drunk harassing a calm man outside a restaurant. Brandon realized it too late. He swung suddenly. Fast right hook aimed at Curtis's jaw. But Curtis moved before the punch fully formed. Not emotional. Reflex, military-trained reflex. He slipped sideways smoothly, and Brandon's fist missed completely, smashing into the side mirror of a parked BMW instead. The crack echoed across the sidewalk. Brandon shouted in pain instantly. The crowd exploded with noise. Phones everywhere now. Curtis stepped backward again, palms open. "No more," he said evenly. But Brandon's eyes had changed. Rage now. Pure and uncontrolled. And across the street inside the black Tahoe, Colonel Victor Grayson finally opened his driver's side door. Brandon Pierce looked stunned for exactly 1 second after hitting the BMW mirror. Pain flashed across his face. Then humiliation erased it. That was the dangerous part. Embarrassed men became reckless faster than angry men. The shattered side mirror hung sideways from the black BMW, while nearby restaurant guests backed farther away across the sidewalk. Multiple phones stayed raised, now recording openly. Curtis remained exactly where he was, hands visible, breathing controlled. He noticed details automatically. Danielle standing near the restaurant entrance with both arms wrapped tightly around herself. A valet discreetly speaking into a radio near the curb. Traffic slowing farther down the street because drivers noticed the commotion. and across the road, Colonel Victor Grayson stepping out of the black Tahoe. Brandon barely noticed any of it. His injured hand curled into a fist again, while rage flooded over embarrassment. "You think this is funny?" he shouted. Curtis answered calmly. "You need to stop." That only made Brandon angrier. He charged it forward again, fast, wild, no control left now. Curtis sidestepped smoothly before impact, and Brandon stumbled past him on wet pavement. Several people gasped as Brandon nearly fell into the valet podium. The crowd reacted differently this time. Not excitement. Discomfort. The performance was collapsing. Brandon spun around immediately, breathing hard. "You keep dodging me." Curtis took another slow step backward. "I'm trying not to hurt you." The sentence landed like gasoline on fire. Brandon roared and lunged again. This time Curtis reacted, not emotionally, mechanically. Brandon grabbed for Curtis's jacket collar with his uninjured hand. Curtis trapped the wrist, instantly rotated sideways, and locked Brandon's arm downward for less than a second. Clean, efficient, controlled, military muscle memory. Brandon's knees buckled immediately under the leverage. Then Curtis released him at once and stepped away again. No punch, no retaliation, just removal of threat. But the difference in skill became obvious to everyone watching. A few people in the crowd actually murmured out loud, "Jesus, that guy's trained." Brandon staggered backward, clutching his wrist in shock. Not injured badly, but exposed. He finally realized something terrifying. Curtis could have destroyed him physically at any moment, and deliberately chose not to. That realization changed the energy instantly. Danielle saw it too. Curtis noticed her expression shift completely near the restaurant doors. For the first time since meeting Brandon, she looked uncertain about him. Not his money, not his confidence. Him. Brandon pointed at Curtis desperately now. "He attacked me." Nobody responded, because dozens of phones recorded the exact opposite. Curtis stayed calm. "You rushed me 3 times." Brandon looked around wildly for support. The crowd had gone quiet now. Even strangers recognized what they were seeing. One man escalating. One man refusing to. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Police coming. Brandon heard them too. Panic flashed across his face before anger covered it again. "You planned this," he snapped. Curtis almost answered, then stopped. Across the street, Colonel Grayson finally crossed toward them through the traffic light. Slow, calm, hands in coat pockets. The crowd instinctively moved aside for him without understanding why. Authority did that. Brandon frowned immediately. "Who the hell is this?" Grayson ignored him completely and stopped beside Curtis. "You all right?" Curtis nodded once. "I'm fine." Grayson looked briefly at the shattered BMW mirror, then at the crowd recording everything. "Good visibility," he said quietly. Curtis understood exactly what he meant. Brandon stepped closer aggressively. "You with him?" Grayson finally looked at Brandon. Cold eyes, military eyes. Yes. Something in Brandon's posture shifted slightly under that gaze. Grayson removed a leather credential holder slowly from his coat pocket. Not law enforcement, not active military, but official enough. Brandon's face tightened. You some kind of cop, numb. Grayson's voice stayed level. But I've spent the last 8 months documenting men exactly like you. That sentence hit harder than a threat. Danielle's face lost color immediately. Brandon glanced toward her for the first time all night. Small mistake. Small sign of fear. Police lights flashed at the end of the street now. 2 Colorado Springs patrol units approached through traffic. Brandon suddenly pointed toward Curtis again. He assaulted me. Nobody in the crowd backed him anymore. Not after the recordings. Not after the restraint hold. One woman near the restaurant entrance even said loudly, "No, he didn't." Others nodded immediately. Collective momentum turning. Dangerous for Brandon. The first officer stepped out of the patrol car quickly. What's going on here? Everyone started talking at once, except Curtis and Grayson. Curtis stayed silent, intentionally. Let witnesses speak first. Always better. The officer looked between the men. Brandon's flushed face. Curtis's steady posture. Broken BMW. Mirror. Crowd holding phones. Then the officer noticed Grayson. Recognition flickered immediately. Colonel Grayson. Interesting. Very interesting. Grayson nodded once. Evening? The officer's posture changed subtly. Respect. History. Somewhere. Brandon noticed that too. What the hell is this? He snapped. The second officer approached the crowd, collecting witness statements, while the first focused on Curtis. Sir, did you strike him? No. Did you restrain him? For less than 1 second after he grabbed me. The officer nodded slowly. Any military training? Yes. Brandon exploded immediately. See? He admitted it. The officer didn't even look at him. Instead, he asked Curtis, did you continue force after separation? No. Did you pursue him? Number simple questions, simple answers. Meanwhile, witnesses began showing phone footage voluntarily. One clip, then another. Every angle showed the same thing. Brandon initiating contact. Brandon throwing the first punch. Curtis retreating repeatedly. Brandon's confidence started collapsing visibly with each new video. Then Grayson spoke quietly to the officer. I believe federal investigators may also have interest in tonight's interaction. That froze Brandon completely. What Grayson reached into his coat and handed over several printed documents. The officer scanned them briefly. Then his expression changed instantly. Not dramatic. Professional. But different. He looked toward Brandon again with new attention. What federal investigators? Brandon asked sharply. Nobody answered him immediately. And that silence finally cracked his composure completely. You can't do this to me, he snapped. You know who I am? Grayson's face remained unreadable. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly why this is happening. Danielle suddenly stepped forward. Brandon, stop talking. Too late. Way too late. The second officer approached holding a phone. This witness has full video from the beginning. Brandon looked around desperately now. Phones, police, witnesses, Grayson. Curtis standing perfectly calm. The audience he wanted had transformed into evidence. Curtis watched the realization happen in real time. Brandon finally understood he lost control hours ago. Maybe days ago. Maybe the moment Curtis refused to react emotionally. The first officer straightened slightly. Mr. Pierce, for tonight we're documenting this as disorderly conduct and aggressive contact pending review of footage. Brandon looked stunned. What about him? The officer glanced toward Curtis. He didn't pursue escalation. Brandon laughed once, sharp, unstable. This is insane. Then another voice spoke from behind the police cars. Not really. Everyone turned. Two men in dark overcoats approached from the far sidewalk. Federal badges visible briefly beneath open jackets. Not FBI windbreakers. Financial Crimes Division. Clean cut. Professional. Curtis recognized the look immediately. Investigators. One of them stopped beside Grayson. You weren't kidding, the man said quietly while watching Brandon. No, Grayson replied. I wasn't. Brandon's face drained completely now. The investigator looked directly at him. Mr. Pierce, he said calmly, we'll be contacting your attorney very soon. No handcuffs, no dramatic arrest. Something worse. Official attention. Publicly. Danielle took one small step backward like her knees suddenly weakened. Curtis noticed everything. The crowd, whispering now, phones still recording. The collapse of Brandon's carefully built image happening in real time under restaurant lights and winter wind. And through all of it, Curtis felt strangely calm. Not victorious, just clear. Because Colonel Grayson had been right from the beginning. Brandon didn't lose tonight because Curtis fought harder. He lost because Curtis never gave him the fight he wanted. As police continued gathering statements, Grayson leaned slightly toward Curtis and spoke low enough that only he could hear. This part spreads fast. Curtis looked toward Brandon standing frozen beneath flashing patrol lights. Good, he said quietly. Then his phone buzzed. A new notification from Rebecca Sloan. Emergency motion filed. Danielle requesting private settlement discussion. First thing tomorrow morning. By Saturday morning, the videos were everywhere. Not national news, not yet, but across Colorado Springs, Denver, and every local social media circle Brandon Pierce built around himself. The footage spread fast. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses. Same conclusion every time. Brandon Pierce challenging a quiet man outside McKenna's steakhouse. Brandon throwing the first punch. Brandon losing control. Curtis watched one version silently from a booth at Maple Diner, while snow drifted softly outside the windows. The diner television above the counter played muted college football highlights nobody paid attention to. Coffee cups clinked. Waitresses moved between booths carrying pancakes and hash browns. Normal morning, abnormal consequences. At 7:42 a.m., a truck driver, 2 booths away, recognized Curtis from the videos. The man looked twice, then looked away carefully. Not mockery. Respect. Curtis noticed it immediately. He still ordered the same breakfast. 2 eggs, bacon, black coffee. Nothing changed outwardly. His phone vibrated constantly on the table beside him. Unknown numbers, missed calls, news blog requests. One message from an old Ranger teammate in Texas, still handling chaos the same way I see. Curtis ignored most of them. Then Rebecca Sloan called. "You awake?" "Yes. You need to come downtown." Curtis looked out the diner window towards slow-moving traffic. "What happened?" "Everything." Her voice carried controlled urgency now. "Pierce lost 2 sponsorship deals overnight. Frontier Wellness accounts are getting frozen. And Danielle's attorney requested emergency settlement talks." Curtis took another sip of coffee. "What about the investigation?" A pause. "Federal Financial Crimes officially opened preliminary proceedings this morning." That moved faster than expected. Curtis understood why. Public humiliation accelerated pressure. Pressure made institutions move quicker once visibility increased. "Where's Danielle?" he asked. "Trying to save herself." Honest answer. At 9:10 a.m., Curtis arrived at Rebecca Sloan's office downtown. The atmosphere inside had changed completely from previous visits. Associates moved faster, phones ringing constantly. Televisions inside waiting areas quietly replayed muted footage from outside McKenna's. Not national coverage, but enough. Rebecca met Curtis immediately outside her office. "You all right?" "Yes." She studied him briefly. No adrenaline crash, no visible ego. Curtis looked the same as always. That still fascinated her. Inside her office, legal folders covered the desk in organized stacks. Rebecca handed him a tablet, already open to financial records. Federal subpoenas started hitting Pierce-connected accounts before sunrise. Curtis scanned the screen. Bank holds, asset reviews, transaction freezes. The walls were closing quickly now. Rebecca sat across from him. "Do you know what finally triggered full escalation?" Curtis looked up. "The videos, partly, but mostly because Pierce publicly confronted a documented witness connected to an ongoing financial inquiry." Curtis leaned back slowly. He panicked. "Exactly." Rebecca folded her hands together. "And panic creates patterns investigators love." Curtis looked again at the frozen account notices. Daniela's name appeared twice. He noticed Rebecca watching his reaction carefully. "What?" Curtis asked. "She requested private settlement before noon today." "Why now?" Rebecca gave him a tired look. "Because she finally understands Brandon can't protect her anymore." That sentence sat heavily in the room. Not because Curtis still loved Danielle the same way, but because part of him remembered who she used to be before all this. Or maybe who he thought she was. Rebecca slid another document toward him. "Motion to dismiss temporary protection concerns against Curtis Hamilton." Interesting wording. Very careful wording. The accusations disappeared fast once evidence entered the room. "At least she corrected the record," Rebecca said quietly. Curtis studied the page silently. Then his phone buzzed again. Danielle. Not text. Call. Rebecca looked toward the screen. "You gonna answer?" Curtis stared at the phone for several seconds before pressing decline. Rebecca nodded once. Good decision. Curtis wasn't sure whether it was. Around noon, the settlement meeting began inside a smaller conference room, overlooking downtown Colorado Springs. Danielle arrived alone. No Brandon, no dramatic confidence, just exhaustion. Curtis noticed changes immediately. Minimal makeup, dark circles beneath her eyes, nervous hands. The woman who once laughed beside rooftop champagne glasses now looked like she hadn't slept at all. She avoided eye contact when she entered. Rebecca remained professional. Mrs. Hamilton? Danielle sat slowly across from Curtis. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Traffic moved below the office windows. Cloud shadows crossed the mountains in the distance. Finally, Danielle broke first. Brandon said the videos would make you look unstable. Curtis said nothing. Danielle laughed bitterly at herself. He really believed that? Rebecca remained quiet intentionally, letting silence work. Danielle rubbed both hands together. They froze his accounts this morning. Curtis looked at her calmly. I heard. He's losing his mind. That part sounded real. Not manipulative. Fear had replaced performance now. Danielle finally looked directly at Curtis. You knew this whole time, didn't you? Curtis answered honestly. I knew something was wrong. Danielle's eyes lowered again. He told me those programs were legitimate. Curtis watched her carefully, not searching for innocence anymore, just truth. And the money, he asked quietly. Danielle swallowed hard. He said it was temporary routing for tax purposes. Rebecca finally spoke. You signed documents without reading them. Danielle's silence answered clearly enough. Curtis leaned back slowly. Years ago, that level of recklessness would have shocked him. Now it just felt... Danielle looked older suddenly, like the last 48 hours stripped away the image she spent months building. I never thought it would get this serious, she whispered. Curtis almost answered immediately, but stopped, because the real answer was obvious. People rarely believed consequences existed until consequences arrived personally. Rebecca opened another folder. Mrs. Hamilton, if you cooperate fully regarding financial transfers, settlement discussions remain possible. Danielle nodded quickly. Too quickly. Fear again? Curtis noticed something else, too. She never defended Brandon once. Not once. At 1:17 p.m., Danielle finally asked the question, sitting underneath everything. How did you stay so calm through all this? Curtis looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because somebody wanted me angry. Danielle's eyes watered slightly. Not dramatic crying, just realization. She finally understood the trap Brandon kept trying to build. Curtis continued quietly. And once I saw that the rest became simple. The room fell silent again. Rebecca's phone buzzed suddenly. She checked the message, and her expression sharpened immediately. What Curtis asked. Rebecca looked up slowly. Federal investigators just searched Pierce Elite Performance. Danielle's face went white instantly. Rebecca continued. They're removing financial records and electronic storage devices now. Curtis remembered the black document boxes visible in Brandon's hotel photo. These storage containers, the shell transfers, all of it collapsing together now. Danielle suddenly covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Oh my God. Curtis watched her quietly. No satisfaction. just distance. Because somewhere between the rooftop party and the fight outside McKenna's, the marriage itself had finally died completely. At 2:04 p.m., Curtis left the law office alone. Cold wind swept through downtown streets while pedestrians hurried past, bundled in winter coats. His phone buzzed again. "Colonel Grayson." Curtis answered. Immediately. "It's moving fast now," Grayson said. "So I heard." A pause. Then Pierce tried contacting one of the auditors this morning. Curtis frowned slightly. "What happened?" He threatened him. Curtis closed his eyes briefly. Another mistake. Another escalation. "He's done," Grayson said quietly. Curtis stood near the crosswalk, watching snow clouds gather again over the mountains. Across the street, people moved normally through coffee shops and bookstores, while one man's entire public identity collapsed in real time. Then Grayson added one final sentence. "Question now is whether Danielle goes down with him." The line went dead. Curtis stood alone in the freezing downtown wind afterward. Then his phone buzzed one more time. Voicemail notification from Danielle. Timestamp 2:17 a.m. the previous night. Curtis stared at it for several seconds, unheard, saved automatically. And for the first time since all this started, he hesitated before pressing play. Curtis listened to the voicemail that night inside his truck, while snow drifted softly across the parking lot outside Maple Diner. The engine idled quietly. Dashboard lights painted the interior dim blue. Danielle's voice came through the speakers uneven and shaky. "Curtis, please call me back." A pause. Background noise, wind, maybe traffic. Then I didn't know how bad this was getting. Curtis stared through the windshield without expression. Danielle kept talking. "He told me everything was legal. He said the transfers were temporary and normal." And her breathing cracked suddenly. "I think he's losing control." Curtis listened silently. Not angry anymore, just tired. The voicemail continued for another minute. Apologies without structure. Fear without clarity. Then one final sentence before the recording ended. "I don't think Brandon's scared of prison. I think he's scared of humiliation." The message ended. Curtis sat still for a long time afterward while snowflakes melted slowly against the windshield. That sentence explained almost everything. Some men feared losing freedom. Brandon feared losing image. Different species of fear entirely. Curtis forwarded the voicemail directly to Rebecca Sloan without comment. Then he drove home. The house looked unfamiliar now. Same white siding, same cracked driveway, but emptier. Danielle hadn't slept there consistently in weeks. Inside, silence filled the rooms differently than before. Not tense anymore. Finished. Curtis removed his boots near the front door automatically and walked through the kitchen. One overhead light remained on above the sink. Danielle used to leave lights on constantly. He noticed himself thinking about her in past tense now. At 11:48 p.m., his phone rang again. "Rebecca, you send me the voicemail." "Yes." "It helps." Curtis leaned against the kitchen counter. "How bad is it for her?" Rebecca hesitated briefly. That depends on how cooperative she becomes, meaning prosecutors could still separate negligence from participation if Danielle moved fast enough. Curtis understood. What about Brandon? Rebecca exhaled slowly. Much worse. Curtis waited. Financial fraud, witness intimidation, potential obstruction, and now the public incident outside McKenna's. Papers shuffled on her end. Investigators think he may have tried moving records after learning about the audits. Curtis remembered Unit 214 immediately. The maintenance corridor, the black document boxes. He did, Curtis said quietly. Rebecca lowered her voice. Federal investigators recovered storage containers from one of his Denver properties this afternoon. Curtis closed his eyes briefly. Finished. Not legally yet, but structurally. The empire Brandon built around confidence and intimidation was collapsing under its own noise. Rebecca spoke again. There's another thing. Curtis listened. Danielle agreed to full settlement terms. That happened faster than expected. She keeps the Denver condo. Curtis asked. No. She's surrendering claim to the house entirely. Curtis looked around the quiet kitchen. The mortgage papers, the old dining table, Duke sleeping near the hallway. Everything suddenly felt strangely distant. She also signed withdrawal statements regarding the intimidation allegations. Curtis nodded once, though Rebecca couldn't see it. Okay. Rebecca sounded almost confused by his calmness. You understand how significant this is, right? Yes. You're walking away clean. Curtis looked out the dark kitchen window toward snow-covered fences. Doesn't feel like winning. Rebecca stayed silent for a second. Then quietly, no, it usually doesn't. The call ended. Curtis stood alone in the kitchen afterward, listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the silence. Then headlights swept across the living room wall outside. A car pulling into the driveway. Curtis looked through the front window. Danielle's Mercedes. Interesting. Very late for unexpected visits. Curtis opened the front door before she knocked. Danielle stood beneath the porch light, wrapped in a dark winter coat, gathering lightly in her hair. She looked exhausted. Actually exhausted. No performance left. You shouldn't be here, Curtis said calmly. I know. Neither moved for a moment. Cold wind drifted between them. Finally, Curtis stepped aside once. Danielle entered quietly. The house suddenly felt smaller with both of them inside again. She looked around the living room, slowly, like someone revisiting a place after years away. Not weeks, years. Duke approached cautiously from the hallway. Danielle knelt automatically to pet him. The dog wagged his tail once. Curtis noticed the gesture hit her emotionally harder than anything else tonight. He still likes you, Curtis said. Danielle laughed weakly through her nose. Dogs are stupidly loyal. Curtis didn't answer. That silence mattered. Danielle stood again slowly. I left Brandon's place. Curtis leaned against the kitchen counter. Okay. He's spiraling. Curtis waited. Danielle rubbed her hands together nervously. He smashed a television tonight because somebody posted another fight video online. Curtis remained expressionless. He keeps saying people are turning against him. Because of you. Curtis looked directly at her. No, he said quietly. People turned against him because they finally saw him. Danielle lowered her eyes. Another silence stretched between them. Then she finally said it. I'm sorry. Simple words, no dramatic crying, no excuses attached this time. Curtis studied her face carefully. He believed she regretted things now. The problem was, regret arrived after consequences, not before choices. Danielle looked around the kitchen again. You know what's weird? She asked softly. Curtis waited. I kept telling myself you were weak because you stayed calm. Curtis said nothing. But Brandon... She shook her head slowly. He needed everybody watching him all the time. Curtis remembered the rooftop live streams, the public confrontations, the audience addiction. Danielle leaned against the counter opposite him. I thought confidence meant strength. Curtis answered quietly. Sometimes confidence is just noise. That stayed between them for several seconds. Then Danielle finally asked the question that had been waiting underneath everything. Did you ever want to hit him? Curtis answered honestly. Yes. Danielle looked surprised by the immediate answer. Curtis continued calmly. But wanting something and doing it aren't the same thing. Outside snow continued falling softly across the dark neighborhood. The clock above the stove read 1:14 a.m. Danielle looked suddenly smaller than Curtis remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The image she built around Brandon had collapsed completely. And now she had nowhere left to stand, except reality. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. Curtis nodded once. Good. The honesty hurt her more than anger would have. But Curtis wasn't trying to punish her anymore. He was simply finished pretending. Danielle wiped at her eyes quickly. I signed the settlement because Rebecca said investigators might consider cooperation. She's right. Danielle swallowed hard. Do you hate me? Curtis thought about the question carefully. About 15 years together. About betrayal. About fake accusations. About Brandon standing outside McKenna's screaming for violence while Danielle watched. Finally, Curtis answered. No. Danielle looked confused by that. Curtis looked toward the dark backyard beyond the kitchen window. I think you lost yourself, trying to live inside somebody else's image. The words hit her harder than shouting ever could. Danielle sat down slowly at the kitchen table, afterwards staring at nothing. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Curtis's phone buzzed again. Colonel Grayson. Curtis answered immediately. Sorry to call late, Grayson said. It's fine. A pause. Then Pierce got dropped by his last major sponsor 20 minutes ago. Curtis looked toward Danielle instinctively. She already knew from his expression. Grayson continued. Federal warrants expand Monday morning. Curtis nodded once. Understood. And Hamilton? Yes, sir. Grayson's voice softened slightly for the first time in weeks. You handled this correctly. Curtis looked around the quiet kitchen. At the woman he once trusted, sitting broken beneath the overhead light. At the house that no longer felt like a marriage. At the silence after months of noise. Then he answered quietly, I just stayed patient. After the call ended, Danielle stood slowly and picked up her purse. I should go. Curtis nodded once. She stopped near the front door. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something else. Instead, she simply whispered, "You really were stronger than him." Then she walked out into the falling snow and disappeared into the night. Curtis locked the door behind her gently. And for the first time in months, the house finally felt quiet instead of tense. 1 year later, Curtis Hamilton still drove the same silver Ford F-150. The paint remained faded near the rear bumper. The driver's side seat still squeaked slightly every time he turned left too fast. And every morning at 6:15 he still parked outside Maple Diner before sunrise. Some having survived everything. Colorado Springs looked different after winter. Early April sunlight cut clean across the mountains west of the city, while snow finally retreated into the higher elevations around Pikes Peak. Curtis sat in his usual booth near the window, drinking black coffee while waitresses prepared the breakfast rush. "Morning," Kurt Louis called from behind the counter. "Morning," normal, quiet. Exactly how Curtis preferred it. The difference now was what came after breakfast. At 7:02 a.m., Curtis pulled into the parking lot of Hamilton Veteran Transition Center on the east side of Colorado Springs. Small brick building. Fresh paint. American flag moving gently in the wind near the entrance. Nothing flashy. No giant branding. No motivational slogans covering the walls. Just practical help. Job placement services. Housing assistance. PTSD counseling referrals. ED, legal support for veterans trying to rebuild ordinary lives. Colonel Victor Grayson stood outside the front entrance, holding 2 coffees when Curtis parked. Still straight-backed, still impossible to intimidate. "You're late," Grayson said. Curtis checked his watch. 1 minute, discipline slipping in old age. Curtis took the coffee. "You retired 3 times already. You don't get to lecture anyone." That earned the smallest smile from Grayson. Inside the center, volunteers arranged folding chairs for the afternoon orientation group. Former military men moved through the halls carrying paperwork, resumes, donated winter coats. No cameras, no live streams, no performance. Curtis preferred it that way. Most mornings he spent the first hour reviewing employment applications and coordinating with local contractors willing to hire veterans transitioning into civilian work. Simple work. Useful work. Real work. At 8:14 a.m., Tyler Jensen entered, carrying 2 cardboard boxes of donated office supplies. He looked older now, more confident, less nervous. "Morning, boss." Curtis frowned slightly. "You still calling me boss?" Tyler grinned. "You sign the checks." "Fair point." Tyler set the boxes down near the reception desk. News station called again. Curtis sighed quietly. "No interviews." That's what I told them. The McKenna's steakhouse footage never fully disappeared online. Clips still resurfaced occasionally. Undertitles like "Quiet, Veteran Humiliates Fake Alpha Male" or "Influencer Picked the Wrong Guy." Curtis hated all of them, because none of those videos understood what really happened. This was never about humiliation. It was about restraint. At 9:30 a.m., Curtis stepped into his office and found an envelope waiting on the desk. No return address, handwritten. He opened it carefully. Inside sat a short note. "Thank you for helping my brother after Afghanistan. He starts work Monday. The Keller family, Curtis." Folded the note quietly and placed it inside his desk drawer beside several others. Those mattered more than headlines ever could. Around noon, Grayson entered the office carrying another coffee. "You hear about Pierce?" Curtis looked up from paperwork. "No." Sentencing hearing moved again. Curtis nodded once. Brandon Pierce eventually pleaded into multiple federal financial fraud charges after investigators uncovered falsified veteran rehabilitation programs, shell companies, intimidation attempts, and hidden account transfers. The public collapse happened fast. The legal collapse took longer. It usually did. "He's still blaming everybody else?" Curtis asked. Grayson sat down across from him. "Mostly." Curtis expected that answer. Men like Brandon rarely understood consequences as personal responsibility. They understood them as unfair attacks. Grayson sipped his coffee. "He asked about you during pre-sentencing evaluation." Curtis raised an eyebrow slightly. "What did he say?" Grayson almost smiled. "He still thinks you manipulated him somehow." Curtis looked out the office window toward the parking lot. Interesting. Even after everything, Brandon still couldn't accept the truth. Nobody trapped him. He simply kept exposing himself publicly until evidence buried him. Grayson watched Curtis quietly for a moment. "You ever regret not putting him in the hospital that night?" Curtis answered immediately. "No, no hesitation, no fantasy, revenge." Because Curtis understood something Brandon never did. Winning a fight and winning a situation were completely different things. At 2:11 p.m., the afternoon orientation group arrived. 7 veterans, different ages, different wars. Same exhausted eyes Curtis recognized instantly. One young Marine sat alone near the back wall with his hood up and arms crossed tightly. Curtis remembered being 30 years old and unable to sit facing doors in restaurants. Some things stayed inside people permanently. Curtis stood at the front of the room quietly. No dramatic speeches. No motivational performance. "Most of you probably feel behind in life right now," he said evenly. "That feeling passes faster if you stop comparing yourself to loud people." The room stayed silent, listening. Curtis continued. "Stability isn't weakness. Quiet work matters. Discipline matters. Simple words, real words." Because Curtis learned something through all the chaos with Danielle and Brandon. A lot of modern life rewarded performance over character. But performance collapsed the second pressure arrived. Character didn't. After the orientation ended, Curtis locked the office filing cabinets, while sunset painted orange light across the mountains outside. The center slowly emptied. Volunteers left. Phone stopped ringing. Silence returned. At 6:04 p.m., a dark SUV pulled into the parking lot outside. Danielle stepped out alone. Curtis watched through the office window without surprise. They spoke occasionally now, mostly practical matters. nothing emotional. Danielle looked different than a year ago. Simpler clothes, less makeup, no performance left. She entered carefully. "I won't stay long." Curtis nodded once. She handed him a folder. "Final property. Transfer paperwork." Curtis took it. Their fingers barely touched. No tension anymore. Just history. Danielle glanced around the center quietly. "You really built this?" "We built it." Danielle looked confused. Curtis nodded toward Grayson's office. "Colonel did most of the funding work." That made her smile faintly. For a moment, she looked closer to the woman Curtis married years ago. Then the moment passed. "How are you?" she asked quietly. Curtis considered the question honestly. "Peaceful." Danielle nodded slowly. "I think that's the thing Brandon never understood." Curtis waited. He thought strength meant controlling rooms. Curtis looked around the quiet center. Empty chairs, coffee stains, resume folders stacked neatly by the printer. "No," he said calmly. "Strength is controlling yourself." Danielle lowered her eyes slightly. Then she gave a small nod. "I know that now." She left a few minutes later without drama. No tears, no promises, just closure. By 8:17 p.m., the building stood empty, except for Curtis. He locked the front doors and stepped outside into the cool Colorado evening. City lights glowed faintly below the mountains, while wind moved through nearby trees. Across the parking lot sat his old Ford beneath the street lamp. Same truck, same quiet man, different life. Curtis stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening to the silence around him. No one shouting, no cameras recording, no audience. And for the first time, in a very long time, he realized he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Life has a strange way of exposing people over time. Loud men often look powerful at first. Calm men often look weak. But pressure reveals character faster than words ever can. Curtis never won because he was stronger physically. He won because he understood that discipline matters more than pride. Patience matters more than ego. And evidence matters more than noise. A lot of people watching this story probably know what it feels like to be underestimated. Maybe you were the quiet one in the relationship, the workplace, or the family. Maybe people mistook your patience for weakness simply because you refused to perform your anger publicly. But staying calm is not surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is survival. If you've ever been judged the wrong way by people who only respected appearances, leave a comment below and share your story. And before you go, tell me your country and local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach around the world. And subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about quiet people who refuse to break under pressure. Tomorrow's story might hit even harder.